In a city where chance is just another name for deception, a frightened woman walks into a brownstone seeking safety and leaves behind an envelope that will turn every certainty into a wager. What begins as a plea for help soon becomes a game no one meant to play, where greed, love, and fate are shuffled together under the watch of one relentless mind. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Settle in, because this mystery begins now. If you've ever worked for a man who believes luck is an insult to intelligence, you'll understand the atmosphere in our brownstone that morning. Wolfe sat in his oversized chair, surrounded by orchids that seemed to nod in silent agreement with his displeasure. Outside, the rain wasn't falling. It was staging a siege. Thunder shook the glass panels, and the gutters were doing their best to drown the city. The cause of Wolfe's irritation, as usual, was mankind. The morning paper had featured a story about a sweepstakes winner who attributed his good fortune to the smiling favor of chance. Wolfe, after one glance, folded the page as though it were a venomous reptile. Chance, he pronounced, is the excuse of the inept. When a man credits fortune for success, he confesses his own incompetence. I told him a little humility never hurt anybody, but that only earned me a glare that could have curdled Fritz's custard. Wolfe once refused to flip a coin to settle a bet, calling it abdication of judgment. I'd kept that memory stored, knowing someday it would fit the weather, grey, brooding, and headed for trouble. I didn't know it yet, but the storm outside wasn't the only one about to break. At exactly 12:30, just as Fritz poked his head in to announce lunch, the doorbell rang. Now, at the Wolfe establishment, interruptions at mealtime rank somewhere between blasphemy and burglary. Wolfe's brow folded into a geography of irritation. "Archie," he said, in the tone of a man commanding an execution, "see who has seen fit to challenge civility." The bell rang again, longer this time. I went to the door, muttering something about lightning striking where it's deserved. When I opened it, the air that blew in was a mixture of rain, fear, and perfume. A young woman stood there, drenched, trembling, and holding a handbag that looked as though it had lost its will to live. Her hat was ruined, her gloves waterlogged, and her eyes, pale, grey, and frantic, searched my face as if I were a last lifeline. "Mr. Wolfe," she managed. "He's here," I said, stepping aside. "But I can't promise you the weather will improve once you're in." I took her coat, which dripped a small lake onto the parquet floor, and guided her to the office. She didn't notice the orchids or the books, just the man behind the desk who looked like he might weigh justice itself before speaking. She gave her name as Marion Keller, voice trembling on the syllables as if they might shatter. Wolfe's eyes opened half an inch wider, his version of rolling out the red carpet. I took a seat near the globe bar and waited. Marion began in halting sentences that tumbled into each other. She had attended a private game 3 nights before, hosted by a man named Dudley Van. Wolfe's eyebrows twitched. He knew the name, and so did I. Van was a financier with a taste for risk and a habit of turning other men's money into his own. Marion said the game had been strange, fortunes wagered not in chips, but in paper, deeds, promises. "They said it was symbolic," she whispered, "but I think someone meant it." Since then, she'd been followed. Her apartment door found ajar, her telephone line crackling with silence. She had come to Wolfe because she was afraid of being unlucky. "Pfoy," Wolfe murmured. "Luck is a fabrication. Someone intends you harm, or you imagine it. There is no metaphysical misfortune." But when her eyes met mine, pleading, terrified, I saw something Wolfe's logic refused to admit. She wasn't imagining anything. There was a shadow following her, and it had already learned her name. Wolfe listened without a flicker of indulgence. His lips pressed into a single uncompromising line, and his hands stayed folded across the arc of his stomach like the gates of a fortress. "My dear Miss Keller," he said finally, I am not a diviner of dread. If you are threatened, you must offer evidence. Emotion is not evidence. She leaned forward, desperate. But I'm being watched. Then call the police, Wolfe interrupted, his tone silk over steel. They have resources better suited to fear. Archie Goodwin, being employed but not gagged, decided to put in his nickel. She's not inventing this, Wolfe. You should have seen her hands when she came in. If that's stage fright, Broadway's missing a star. He gave me the kind of glance that could prune an orchid. Archie, compassion is your vice. Kindly refrain from practicing it in my office. Marion looked between us, one wall of intellect, one of sympathy, and realized the outcome. Her shoulders sagged. I thought you'd understand, she whispered, then rose, her handbag clutched tight. She left behind a faint trail of perfume and something else, dread, sharp and metallic, hanging in the air long after the door closed. I was halfway through telling Wolfe he'd just sent a frightened woman into the rain when he noticed the envelope on the desk. It hadn't been there before. Goodwin, he said, frowning. Did our guest leave a gratuity? I picked it up. The paper was cheap, but the seal, an odd, hand-drawn wheel, inked in black, caught my eye. Inside were 5 torn playing cards, each defaced with strange pencil symbols, circles, lines, and marks that might have been letters or a code. Wolfe examined them as if they offended him personally. Fetishistic nonsense, he pronounced. The flotsam of hysteria. I slipped the cards into my pocket. Maybe, but she was scared enough to leave them behind. Might mean something. Bah. If it were meaning she wanted, she should have brought coherence. He leaned back, eyes closing, dismissing both the cards and the woman from his universe. But I couldn't. There was something deliberate about that envelope. Not a mistake, but an invitation. Outside, thunder rolled again, and I could have sworn it sounded like someone shuffling the deck. When the front door clicked shut behind Marion Kellor, the house seemed to inhale the quiet. Fritz resumed clattering in the kitchen, though even his copper pans seemed subdued. Wolfe returned to his chair and the orchids, which had never betrayed him with emotion. I lingered near the desk, feeling like a man who'd just watched a ship sink in slow motion. You could have taken her case, I said. I could have taken the measles, he replied. Both are contagious and unnecessary. I gave him a look. You're making a bad bet, boss. That woman's in real trouble. He grunted, unimpressed. You persist in mistaking sentiment for sagacity. Instinct is a treacherous compass, Mr. Goodwin. Maybe, but sometimes it points toward the truth faster than your slide rule. He ignored me, of course, and turned back to the orchids. The rain intensified, slapping the windows like impatient fingers. I told myself I was being dramatic, but somewhere inside, I knew the day wasn't done with us yet. It was nearly 6 when the phone rang. I picked it up, expecting a client or, worse, a bill collector. Instead, Lon Cohen from the Gazette came through, his voice sharp and low. Archie, he said. That woman who came to see Wolfe today, Marion Kellor, she's dead. The words hung there, sour and unreal. Suicide, he added. Jumped from her apartment window. The cops are saying she left a note. I thanked him and hung up slowly. Wolfe hadn't moved, but his eyes were open now, heavy and dark. I told him. He didn't speak for several seconds. Then, with a sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than lungs, he reached toward the envelope on the desk. He drew out one of the torn cards, studied the jagged edge, and murmured, Chance, Mr. Goodwin, is the refuge of fools and murderers. The rain had stopped, but the air in the room was colder. I looked at the cards, at Wolfe, at the empty chair where Marion had sat, and I knew we'd just been dealt our first hand, whether Wolfe liked it or not. When Nero Wolfe changes his mind, he doesn't announce it. He merely behaves as though his first decision had never existed. That morning, after his firm declaration that Marion Kellor's fears were imaginary, I found him at his desk, the envelope she'd left resting in, the center blotter, like an accusation. He wasn't reading the paper, nor was he admiring his orchids. He was staring at those torn cards with the look of a man whose peace had been personally insulted. "You were wrong," I said, "because it's my job to help the sun rise in Wolfe's world. Violently, if necessary." He lifted a finger, the universal symbol for silence. "I am not concerned, Archie. I am irritated. The distinction is vital. A falsehood masquerading as probability, suicide indeed, disturbs my reason." "Your reason?" I echoed. "That's a new word for conscience." He didn't bother replying. When Wolfe begins parsing vocabulary, it's a sure sign he's thinking. I took my hat from the rack. "All right, if it's reason you want, I'll go find some. The Gazette says the girl took a dive from her window. I'll check how far she fell, and whether anyone helped her jump." Wolfe grunted, which meant approval disguised as annoyance. "Foy, you'll get wet." "Don't worry," I said, shrugging on my raincoat. "You've made it clear that luck doesn't exist. I'll take my chances anyway." I left him there, still glaring at the cards. A man who hated coincidence, facing one he could no longer ignore. You can tell a lot about death by its smell. Some are quick and merciful. Others linger in the air like unpaid rent. Marion Keller's apartment had the second kind. The police had already come and gone, leaving behind their usual perfume of wet boots and bad coffee. And at the centre of it, all stood Inspector Kramer, red-faced, thick-necked, and radiating impatience like a furnace. "Well, well," he said. "Wolfe finally sent his errand boy." "That's me," I said. "Fresh from the kennel. What's the story?" "No story. She jumped. Case closed." "Then why's your neck redder than usual?" He grunted and pointed to the open window. Neighbour saw her alone. Door was locked from the inside. No signs of struggle. Suicide note on the table. "Take your fairy tales back to that fat philosopher of yours." I ignored the jab. I did a slow turn of the room. Neat little apartment, too neat. The kind of place where everything had its spot, until someone decided to move one thing too many. The note lay beside an overturned ashtray. I didn't read it. Kramer's glare said I'd need a court order. Instead, I looked out the window. Rainwater streaked the sill, but the latch was unfastened. Maybe the storm had loosened it, or maybe someone had. "Mind if I admire the view?" I asked. "Suit yourself," he said, "but don't start seeing ghosts. The case is clean." Maybe it was, but it smelled dirty. Kramer had moved to the door to bark at a patrolman, which gave me a minute. The window was narrow, the latch slightly bent. As I leaned closer, my hand brushed something wedged into the corner. Small, round, and smooth. A poker chip, ivory-coloured, with a faint smudge of red along the rim. Not something Marion Keller would use to hold her window open on a rainy night. I turned it over in my fingers. The edges were worn, the centre stamped with a stylized wheel. Fortune's wheel, to be exact. I slipped it into my pocket, just as Kramer's voice rolled back across the room. "Goodwin, you done sightseeing?" "Almost," I said. "Just admiring your efficiency." He gave me a look that could peel paint. "Tell Wolfe to stay out of this one. We've got it wrapped." "Of course," I said sweetly. "I'll tell him that the city's in safe hands." On my way out, I let my eyes travel once more over the room. Suicide, they said. The window latch disagreed. And now, my pocket did too. Outside, the rain was steady again, tapping my hat brim like a reminder. If luck didn't exist, as Wolfe claimed, then someone had worked hard to create its perfect imitation. Wolfe picked up on the first ring. That, in itself, was proof the case had him hooked. "Well?" he demanded. "Suicide, official version. Window open, latch loose. Except for one small detail. A poker chip left to keep it that way. Ivory, marked with a wheel." There was a pause, the kind that meant he was smiling without the inconvenience of showing it. "A wheel? How fitting. Did it spin?" I didn't try, I said. Kramer was watching. Mr. Dudley Van, Wolfe murmured, almost to himself, is a man who believes destiny can be managed by arithmetic, a pernicious conceit. I take it you've moved from irritation to curiosity? Pfui. Curiosity is the handmaiden of folly. This is inquiry, a far nobler occupation. Call it what you want, I said. Where do I start? With the game, he replied. The fortune game. Find who played. Find what was wagered. Men seldom gamble with what they can afford to lose. I smiled. Sounds easy. Just identify everyone who's ever made a bad decision in New York. Begin, he said curtly, and hung up. The rain had lightened, but something else had darkened. The name Dudley Van was beginning to feel like a loaded deck, and I'd just been dealt in. By dusk, I was sitting at the Golden Derby Club, which looked exactly as expensive as its name sounded. The man across from me was a bartender named Jess Haller, one of those friendly types who never trust you but enjoy pretending they do. Van's game, he said, lowering his voice. That wasn't poker, friend. That was theatre. 5 or 6 players, all rich enough to lose their shirts and still buy new ones. They called it the fortune game. I kept my tone casual. High stakes? Not money, he said. Worse. Stock shares, contracts, political favours. One guy even staked his wife's jewellery. Not for cash, but as proof he'd honour his word. Every hand came with a secret attached. Sounds cosy. Until someone lost more than he meant to, he said. Hale, the broker, he left white as a sheet. The lady, Keller, tried to talk to him afterward, but Van broke it up. I leaned back, pretending disinterest, but my pulse had found a rhythm. And who ran the table? Haller grinned. Van, always Van. Called himself a dealer of destinies. When I left the club, the air felt thinner. If Wolfe was right, fortune wasn't random, it was rigged, and someone had started collecting on the debt. It took the rest of the evening and a few discreet phone calls to pull the list together. By midnight, I had 5 names and a headache. Dudley Van, financier, gambler, philosopher of fate. Marion Keller, his frightened guest, now a corpse. Hal Trent, journalist with a grudge and an empty wallet. Claire Latham, war widow with debts and a flair for tragedy. Barton Hale, investment broker who'd already lost more than he could replace. Looking at those names, I could feel Wolfe's words echoing. Men seldom gamble with what they can afford to lose. Every one of them had something worth stealing or killing for. I called Saul Panzer to start digging, then caught a cab home. The city outside was slick and reflective, like a pack of cards spread under rainlight. Somewhere among those 5 names was a dealer who hadn't folded yet. When I returned to the brownstone, Wolfe was exactly where I'd left him, as though gravity had sworn loyalty to him personally. The torn cards from Marion's envelope were spread across his desk in a precise semicircle. He didn't look up as I entered. The list? I handed it over. He read each name slowly, nodding once. Then he gestured toward the cards. Mr. Goodwin, one of those who played that night, is playing still. And the stakes, he touched a finger to the torn paper, are mortal. Meaning what? I asked. Meaning, he said, that the game has not concluded. It merely changed tables. There was nothing more to add. The rain had stopped entirely, but the air inside the brownstone felt charged, like a deck waiting for the cut. Bring me, Wolfe said, every name, address, and association tied to this absurd theatre. We will see how long fortune continues to favour its fools. I nodded and reached for my hat again. The game was on, and Wolfe, the man who despised luck, was about to make his own. It took me half a day, a borrowed overcoat, and the promise of 2 $20 bills to gain entrance to what used to be the Langley auction house on East 43rd. Once upon a time, the place had dealt in antiques and bankrupt estates. Now, it specialised in the same trade, only with people instead of furniture. The main floor was dark, stripped of its former dignity, but behind a locked door and down a narrow flight of stairs, the air thickened with old smoke and money that had changed hands too often. The caretaker, a grey man with more nerves than teeth, called it the meeting room. I called it the grave of good fortune. Velvet drapes still lined the walls, faded to the colour of rusted blood. A few overturned chairs, a forgotten glass, a broken chip scattered near the table's edge, all remnants of something that had gone sour. The silence there was unnatural. It wasn't peace, but residue, as if the air itself remembered what the players had wagered and refused to let it go. Wolfe had told me to find where luck had been sold. I had found its burial ground instead. And the dealer, I suspected, had written the epitaph. The caretaker was the sort of man who apologized to doorknobs and flinched at his own echo. I bought him coffee and let him talk, though it came out in spurts like a leaking faucet. He never spoke, he said. Not once, not to them, not to me. Who? I asked. The dealer, he whispered, as if the name might come back to collect a debt. Tall man. Always wore gloves, even in summer. He handled the bets, shuffled the cards, and when someone lost, he nodded once, just once. And they knew it was done. And where is he now? His fingers trembled around the cup. Gone. The night that woman died, the one from the papers. He disappeared. Didn't come back for his pay. Left the cards on the table. I didn't buy it. Disappearances like that didn't happen without orchestration. The dealer hadn't fled. He'd folded himself neatly into the shadows and waited for the next hand to be dealt. When I left him, the caretaker called after me. Some men play for money, mister. Others play to decide who keeps breathing. I didn't look back. I already knew which kind Wolfe would be interested in. By the time I returned to the brownstone, Wolfe had finished lunch and was indulging in postprandial philosophy, his favourite dessert. I gave him the report, omitting the part about the mildew, since that kind of atmosphere would have offended him more than murder. So, he said, steepling his fingers, our dealer speaks through gesture, a silent arbiter, convenient if one wishes to remain unaccountable. He's unaccountable, all right, I said. He's also missing. Pfui. Wolfe's lips twisted in contempt. Men who vanish are rarely gone. They merely reposition themselves where the eyes of others are least competent. Then maybe you can lend me yours, I said, because the only eyes in that club now belong to rats. He closed his eyes briefly, which was his version of smiling. Human concealment, Mr. Goodwin, like gambling, depends not on courage, but illusion. The dealer is hiding, and I suspect he no longer needs a table to play his game. That was Wolfe's way of saying he'd already moved 3 steps ahead. Me, I was still on the first, wondering who the next card would turn over. Kramer arrived at 7, pounding the door like he intended to arrest the hinges. He was red-faced, wet from the rain, and exhaling smoke like a derailed locomotive. Where is he? He barked. In the only place he fits, I said. Follow the scent of beer and irritation. Kramer stomped in, dragging his temper with him, and faced Wolfe like a prosecutor addressing a reluctant witness. Hale's dead, he announced. Skull cracked. Burglary, they're saying. I'm saying otherwise. Wolfe didn't move. Do enlighten me. You had a visit from that Keller girl before she took a dive. Now another player from the same poker circle ends up dead. Coincidence? Coincidence, Wolfe murmured, is the disguise of connection. That slowed Kramer for a second. You know something. I know that 2 people are dead and that you are wasting energy performing indignation in my office. Sit down, Inspector. He didn't. I did. Watching those 2 was like watching a thunderstorm over still water. Kramer all noise and flash, Wolfe immovable, patient, waiting for nature to exhaust itself. When Kramer finally left, Wolfe's only comment was, now we are certain, the stakes have doubled. And from the look in his eyes, I knew that wasn't relief. It was invitation. By midnight, Wolfe had his sleeves rolled up, which for him was the equivalent of bare-knuckle work. He dictated instructions for Saul Panzer to follow the money trail between Barton Hale and Dudley Van. "If one man is dead and the other lives," he said, "then their accounts will tell us which was poorer in foresight." I had Marion's torn cards spread across the desk. Under better light, the markings didn't seem random anymore. Each fragment bore a symbol, partial letters, geometric lines. When arranged by their suits, they spelled something faint but coherent. "Fortune is borrowed." I mentioned it, and Wolfe leaned back, eyes half closed. "Borrowed, yes, as are all things that men mistake for possession. Wealth, luck, affection. Each is a loan with unannounced interest." "That's charming," I said. "Care to quote that to Kramer next time he's here?" He ignored me, as usual. "Debt," he murmured, "is the skeleton key to motive. When the arithmetic of greed exceeds the capacity for repayment, murder provides the only reconciliation." I said nothing. Wolfe was right, and I hated that he sounded almost poetic when he was. The cards lay silent between us, waiting for someone else to calculate the final sum. It was nearly 1 when the phone rang. Wolfe was upstairs among his orchids, which left me to play secretary. Saul Panzer's voice came through the line, low and precise as always, but there was an edge I hadn't heard before. "Archie, something's off," he said. Hale's accounts were empty. He'd been liquidating assets for months, but 3 days before he died, someone wired him $50,000. No source, no sender, just the deposit. "That's generous for a dead man," I said. "Too generous," Saul replied. "And get this, the funds came from an untraceable offshore account. Someone was paying him off or buying silence." I wrote it down carefully. "All right, keep digging. And Saul, watch your back." He gave a short laugh. "Always do." When I hung up, the house felt larger and quieter than it should. Upstairs, Wolfe's orchid slept in artificial light, and I sat at the desk, staring at the phrase on the torn cards. "Fortune is borrowed." Apparently, so was life. And someone was collecting early. When Nero Wolfe summons people to his house, they don't come for tea and conversation. They come because he has decided the time for pretense has expired. By 6 that evening, the office had been transformed into his private courtroom. No jury, no bailiff, and certainly no mercy. The surviving players of the so-called fortune game filed in under Archie Goodwin's watchful eye. Dudley Van, tall and oiled with money. Claire Latham, widow and ornament of regret. And Hal Trent, the journalist whose cynicism had worn thin around the edges. They carried the air of people attending their own financial audit, hoping the verdict might yet be merciful. Wolfe sat motionless behind his desk, the chair framing him like a throne made for intellect rather than comfort. The room itself did the rest. The books, the closed curtains, the absence of sound. Every guilty conscience in the city would have started to sweat in that stillness. And these 3 were no exception. I stayed standing near the Globe Bar, my post for such occasions, and watched the air grow tighter, the way it always does before Wolfe decides which thread to pull first. He didn't need a gavel. His silence was enough. It takes a certain kind of arrogance to conduct an interrogation without ever rising from your chair, and Wolfe had perfected it into an art. While I fetched brandy and glasses, he sat like a monument to composure, regarding the trio before him with the calm of a man reading an obituary he had already written. Van's gold lighter clicked open and shut, the rhythm of nerves disguised as habit. Claire Latham's gloved fingers trembled against her handbag, and Hal Trent crossed and uncrossed his legs with the mechanical precision of someone rehearsing innocence. Wolfe observed all of it, his eyes half-lidded but keen as razors. "My purpose," he began, "is to understand whether luck exists, and if so, whom it serves." The question, as usual, sounded philosophical, until one remembered that Wolfe never wasted philosophy on abstraction. He let the silence stretch until it began to do the talking for him. Each of you, he continued, played in the game. Each of you profited or lost. You will tell me, with candor if possible, what fortune meant to you. Trent opened his mouth first, a poor tactical move, and Wolfe smiled faintly, as if the first card had been turned. If Wolfe had a hobby apart from orchids and beer, it was the dismantling of dishonest sentences. The man could unbutton a falsehood with the delicacy of a tailor removing stitches. Trent began with protestations. He had known Marion Keller only slightly, admired her spirit, regretted her accident. Wolfe sliced through it with one remark. Admiration, Mr. Trent, is the most convenient emotion. It flatters the dead and excuses the living. Van's turn came next. He claimed the fortune game was merely diversion, harmless in intent. Wolfe raised an eyebrow. Harmlessness, Mr. Van, is seldom proclaimed by those who practice it. That one landed squarely. Van's lighter froze mid-flick. Claire Latham tried tears. She spoke of loneliness, of debt, of being drawn into something she did not understand. Wolfe listened without pity. Understanding, madam, is not a prerequisite for guilt. I watched the three of them twist under his words. It wasn't shouting that did it. It was precision, the slow tightening of logic's noose. He'd taken their testimonies and folded them neatly into contradictions. By the time he leaned back, silence filled the room again. A silence heavy with the sound of people realizing that the truth had just started breathing down their necks. For a while, it looked like Wolfe's patience would outlast theirs. Then Claire Latham broke the rhythm. Her voice came sharp and sudden, as though the words had clawed their way out of her throat. You want truth, she said. Then take it. That night, Hale and Van argued over the wheel, the carved one on the table. Hale said it was missing. Van told him to keep quiet. Her confession dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Van's face turned the shade of cold porcelain. Wolfe's gaze didn't move. This wheel, he asked softly. What was its purpose? It was symbolic, she said. Fate's hand. Whoever held it dealt the next round. But when it disappeared, Hale accused Van of taking it. They shouted. The game ended. Pfui, Wolfe murmured. Symbolism is a convenient refuge for guilt. Van started to speak, thought better of it, and reached for his lighter again. Wolfe folded his hands, satisfied that the pattern was forming. For the first time that evening, I caught the faintest glimmer of anticipation in his eyes. Something in that missing wheel had started the machinery in his head turning, and once that happened, there was no stopping it. The interruption came from the hallway, where I'd left the phone on standby. Saul Panzer's voice came through the receiver, clipped and efficient as always. By the time I walked back into the room, Wolfe's eyes were already waiting for the update. Hale wasn't losing money, I told him. He was losing patience. He'd traced Van's so-called charitable trust to a string of shell accounts, overseas, anonymous, and illegal enough to make the Treasury blush. Marion Keller found out too. Hale was planning to expose Van's racket. Trent swore softly. Van said nothing. Claire Latham pressed her handkerchief to her mouth, as though silence might undo what I'd just said. Wolfe absorbed the report with the serenity of a man watching a storm approach from behind glass. Mr. Van, he said finally, you dealt in charity, but your currency was deceit. Miss Keller, having observed the game too closely, became a liability. Hale, determined to speak, became another. Van's voice cracked. That's absurd. You have no proof. Not yet, Wolfe said. But logic, Mr. Van, precedes evidence as thunder precedes rain. I could see it then, the faint, unmistakable spark of pleasure in Wolfe's eyes. He had just heard the echo of truth, and he was already measuring the room for its source. Wolfe leaned forward slightly, a movement as deliberate as most men's monologues. His tone was soft, measured, but each word struck like a metronome of inevitability. The wheel, he began, was no ornament. It was a token of control. Whoever held it decided outcomes not by chance but by design. When it vanished, the illusion of fairness collapsed, and when illusion fails, fear takes its place. Van stiffened, but Wolfe continued, eyes half closed as if dictating to the air. Someone spun fate to their liking, determining who would win, who would lose, whose fortune would vanish next. It was not gambling, it was orchestration. When discovery threatened, murder restored balance. Claire made a small sound, halfway between breath and confession. Trent's fingers tapped his knee in rhythm with guilt. I watched them both, knowing Wolfe's voice could strip varnish off any pretense. The missing wheel, he said finally, is not lost, it is held, and its holder, he opened his eyes, will not relinquish it willingly. He let the words hang there, neither question nor accusation, just a challenge waiting for gravity to pull it down. After the guests left, I suggested we call Kramer. Wolfe's expression made it clear that if I valued continued employment, I'd reconsider. We are not yet finished, he said. To call now would be premature. The dealer must show his face. Maybe he already has, I countered. Maybe you just don't like the cards. He gave me a look that belonged in a museum. Your metaphor is juvenile, but apt. The final card has not been dealt. We will wait. That ended the debate. Wolfe sat back, eyes closed, fingers interlaced, the picture of still intellect. The torn cards lay before him, their strange symbols catching the lamplight. He regarded them as though they might move of their own accord. When I left him to his silence, I had the uneasy sense that he wasn't waiting for a call or a clue. He was waiting for the next move, from someone who understood the game as well as he did. It was close to midnight when the doorbell rang. Wolfe was upstairs. Fritz had gone to bed. I opened the door, expecting night air and nothing else, but there it was. An envelope resting neatly on the stoop, glistening with a few drops of rain. No messenger, no footprints. Inside, a single tarot card, the Wheel of Fortune. The ink shimmered faintly where it had been touched by water. Across its back, written in an elegant, deliberate hand, your turn to play. I took it to the office. Wolfe was already there, summoned by something deeper than sound. His eyes flicked over the card, and for once, words didn't come immediately. Then, softly. So, the dealer makes his bid. I tried a quip, but it died halfway. There was something in Wolfe's face, not fear exactly, but attention sharpened to a point. He laid the card beside the torn ones from Marion's envelope. The wheel, it seemed, had spun again, and this time it had stopped at our door. There's an art to being followed, or more precisely, to pretending you don't notice. Most men spot a tail and either quicken their pace or start looking over their shoulder like a guilty conscience in motion. I prefer the middle ground. Slow down, light a cigarette, and let the city think you're in love with it. That afternoon, Midtown was its usual mixture of arrogance and noise, but under the hum I could feel it, the rhythm that didn't belong. The same pair of footsteps behind me for 5 blocks, neither closing in nor falling back. When I stopped to inspect a window display of overpriced ties, he stopped too, with the casual precision of someone who'd read the manual. Now, Nero Wolfe has lectured me often enough about instincts being the primitive luxury of the uneducated, but even he'd admit they have their uses. Mine told me the man behind me wasn't a pickpocket or a bill collector. He was a professional and nervous enough to make mistakes. I decided to give him the opportunity. I turned east toward Lexington, a direction that's never led to peace for anyone I've tailed, or anyone who's tried to tail me. The city seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see who'd blink first. When Wolfe sends me after someone, he insists on precision. Observation, Mr. Goodwin, is the only legitimate pursuit. I'd taken that to heart. So instead of running, I began to orbit. 2 blocks north, 1 west, doubling back twice, pausing to tie a shoe that didn't need it. Each time, my shadow adjusted, like a metronome keeping my tempo. He was competent, I'll give him that. No hat, no coat despite the chill, and the kind of grey suit you forget the second you stop looking. His mistake was rhythm. He matched mine too closely, which made the pattern stand out. By the time we reached the alley off Lexington, I was certain. I stepped aside into the narrow cut between buildings, letting the wet brick close around me. When he passed the corner, I spoke quietly. "You've been getting your exercise, friend. Care to tell me why?" He froze, one hand half raised, mouth opening on words that never arrived. The sound that did come was a single, flat crack, sharp enough to fold the air. He staggered, turned once like a puppet whose strings had been cut, and dropped at my feet. I didn't chase the shooter. The echo of the shot was already dissolving into the city, and I knew how fast Manhattan forgets a noise it doesn't want to explain. There's no polite way to describe what's left behind by a gunshot at close range. The man was face down, still warm, breathing reduced to a faint rattle that didn't have long to argue. I checked his pockets out of habit, though I already knew what I wouldn't find. No wallet, no papers, no name. Only a matchbook from the Golden Derby Club, a name that had begun to feel like a bad refrain. The revolver lay a few feet away, slick with rainwater. I didn't touch it. I could already imagine Inspector Kramer's voice asking how it happened to have my fingerprints on it. A patrol car's siren was wailing somewhere uptown, but it would be minutes before it reached us. I waited just long enough to see the man's final breath turn into stillness. When the police came, they came loud. The gun, they said later, was registered to Hal Trent, the journalist whose definition of honesty changed depending on his audience. I didn't argue. The city was full of liars. Wolfe and I just made a living finding the ones who paid for it with blood. Hal Trent answered his door the way a guilty man greets a tax auditor, pale, angry, and prepared to lie for sport. His apartment was the kind of shabby that pretends to be bohemian. A typewriter on the table, whiskey on the floor, and newspapers layered like fossils. "Save the sermon," I said. "One of your guns just auditioned for the Philharmonic." He stared, then swore under his breath. "It's a frame. I haven't fired that revolver in months." "Then you won't mind if the police ask where it's been vacationing." Trent's laugh was bitter. "You think I'd be stupid enough to kill one of Van's errand boys? I'm writing an exposé, not a eulogy. The man you found was on his payroll." That raised an eyebrow. "And Marion Kellor?" He hesitated. "I met her before she died. She wanted to talk, said she had proof Van's games weren't games at all, but she was terrified. I told her I'd print her story if she lived long enough to see it." "She didn't," I said. "I know." His eyes flicked toward a desk drawer. "She left me a note. Maybe it'll mean something to you. Or to Wolfe. It doesn't mean a damn thing to me, except that she was right to be afraid." I took it without comment. He looked like a man standing in the shadow of his own obituary. The note was on cheap stationery, folded twice and smudged at the edges. The kind of thing a woman writes in a hurry when the world's already closing in. It read, "He said the cards are not chance. They're judgment." That was all. No signature, no explanation. Just that one cryptic sentence. I kept reading it as I rode back downtown, trying to hear her voice in the words, judgment. It wasn't the kind of term gamblers use unless the stakes have turned personal. It sounded like Wolfe's territory, moral philosophy wrapped in human error. When I got to the brownstone, Fritz told me Wolfe had been in his office all morning, door closed, ignoring both lunch and reason. That meant he was thinking. And when Wolfe thinks too long, the temperature in the house drops a few degrees. I slipped the note into my pocket and decided to wait until his door opened on its own. Whatever game we were playing, the rules were changing faster than I could shuffle. and I had a feeling Wolfe already knew who was holding the deck. There are few sights rarer than Nero Wolfe in motion. That afternoon, I saw it. He was pacing, which in our household is equivalent to a public emergency. "Archie," he said without preamble, "for the next 24 hours, we are in retreat. No calls, no clients, no interruptions. You will bar the door." I raised an eyebrow. Should I hang a sign that says, "Genius at work"? He ignored that. "My faculties require isolation. I am on the threshold of an intolerable conclusion, and I will not be distracted." Fritz and Theodore took the hint and moved about like monks during silent prayer. I stayed in the office, pretending to sort notes while Wolfe prowled the rug like a bear in captivity. I'd seen him brood before, but this was different. His muttering came in fragments, odds, debts, and the word wheel repeated under his breath. At one point, he stopped abruptly and said, "Archie, do you recall the Latin maxim fortuna caeca est?" "Sure," I said. "Luck is blind." He nodded once. "And yet men never stop wagering that she can be seduced." That was all he gave me. Whatever was spinning in his head, I'd have to wait for it to stop. At midnight sharp, the silence broke. Wolfe's voice came from the office. One word: "Archie." When Wolfe calls you at that hour, you go, even if you're in bed with pneumonia or an alibi. He was seated again, restored to immobility, eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a man who's wrestled chaos into logic. "We've been playing the wrong game," he said. I sat down. "Meaning?" "The dealer never left the table." That was pure Wolfe, cryptic as a crossword, but twice as smug. He leaned back, fingers steepled. "Our assumptions were faulty. We sought the hand that dealt ruin, when we should have sought the mind that defined it. The instrument has not vanished, Mr. Goodwin. It continues to function." I didn't interrupt. When Wolfe reached this pitch, interruptions were like poking a hibernating tiger. He turned his gaze to the torn cards on his desk. "Tomorrow," he said, "we begin anew. The illusion of luck is exhausted. Now we will find the logic." He reached for his beer, calm again. I stayed quiet, because the air felt different. Heavier somehow, as though the next move in this game wouldn't be ours to make. There are two things Nero Wolfe detests more than human folly: physical effort and being wrong. For 48 hours, he had indulged in neither. He hadn't moved from his chair, hadn't shaved, and hadn't spoken except to instruct Fritz on the precise temperature at which beer ceases to be an instrument of civilization. And yet, when he finally rang for me, his eyes held that rare gleam, the one that meant the storm had organized itself inside his skull. "Archie," he said, "summon Mr. Panzer." That was my first clue. Wolfe doesn't call Saul into a matter unless he's about to land a fish big enough to require 3 nets and a sermon afterward. When Saul arrived, Wolfe folded his hands and pronounced the verdict of 2 days' silence. "Gentlemen, the mystery we face is not one of luck, but of design. Chance is merely the mask worn by structure when it prefers anonymity. The pattern is visible now." Saul glanced at me, and I shrugged. When Wolfe started talking in architecture, it meant someone's foundation was about to crack. And sure enough, I could already hear the faint creak of Dudley Vans. Wolfe began his lecture in the tone of a man dissecting inevitability. "The so-called dealer," he said, "was never an outsider. He was the host himself. Mr. Van's game of fortune was merely a theatre of control, a charade allowing him to manipulate results under the guise of randomness. He didn't look at me. He didn't have to. Consider," he continued, "the silence of the croupier, the gloved hands, the anonymity. Who better to preside unseen than the man who owned the table? Van's disguise was not for concealment from his guests, but from his conscience." I couldn't help muttering, "That's one way to stack the deck." "Indeed," Wolfe replied, unamused. "He dealt ruin with the serenity of a mathematician. To orchestrate loss, to apportion despair, that was his pleasure. He did not gamble with money, Mr. Goodwin. He gambled with human nature. And like all gamblers, He eventually mistook mastery for invulnerability. Wolfe's voice cooled, and for a moment, even the air seemed to draw back. The dealer gentleman never existed. He was a fiction Van devised to absolve himself. But the author of fiction is always betrayed by his handwriting. When Wolfe reconstructs a crime, it isn't performance, it's autopsy. He laid out Marion Keller's final hours with the precision of a clockmaker taking apart time itself. Miss Keller, he said, was perceptive enough to see that Van's fortunes were prearranged, the stakes were illusions. Those who believed they wagered stocks or estates were, in truth, offering leverage, material for Van's extortion. He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. She confronted him. It was her first intelligent act and her last. When she realized the full scope of his deception, she attempted to warn another participant, Mr. Hale, who had already begun to suspect. For both, revelation proved fatal. I listened, jotting notes I didn't need. His tone had turned almost detached, and I found that harder to stomach than the details themselves. Wolfe could describe murder as if it were a chemical reaction. Tragic, yes, but inevitable. So, I said finally, she drew the wrong card. Not at all, he replied. She drew the right one, Mr. Goodwin. It was merely dealt from the wrong hand. And that, somehow, was worse. The plan came together with Wolfe's usual disdain for motion, and my usual enthusiasm for everything it required. Saul and I were to bait the hook, an anonymous investor, eager to bankroll Van's next benevolent fraud. The meeting, naturally, would take place under Wolfe's roof. I prefer to conduct confrontations in an environment immune to contamination, Wolfe said, meaning his office. Here, deceit has no oxygen. I pointed out that deceit usually brought its own. He ignored that, as expected, and detailed every syllable of the invitation we were to deliver. The words were crafted with surgical elegance, promise, flattery, and just enough danger to tempt a man accustomed to tampering with fate. Saul raised an eyebrow when we left. You think he'll bite? He's a gambler, I said. He'll convince himself it's a rescue, not a trap. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe had already arranged the chairs as if setting the stage for judgment. When he does that, you can feel it. The sense that the world has narrowed to a single room, and that truth, whatever it turns out to be, has already been invited in. Dudley Van arrived in a cloud of expensive confidence that thinned out the moment he crossed the threshold. Wolfe greeted him with the politeness of a surgeon welcoming a patient who didn't yet know the diagnosis. Mr. Van, he said, please be seated. Your reputation precedes you, though regrettably not in the form you might prefer. Van smiled, the kind of smile meant to buy time. From where I stood, I caught the faint bulge beneath his jacket, the unmistakable profile of a revolver. I didn't mention it, Wolfe already knew. You've made a mistake, Van began. I came here under the impression that you were to deceive another investor. Yes, it is gratifying to confirm my prediction. Wolfe's tone was velvet over steel. You see, sir, deceit has a rhythm. Yours is remarkably consistent. The colour drained from Van's face, but Wolfe's gaze held him like a pinned specimen. You have presided as the dealer in a game of moral bankruptcy. You determined who would prosper and who would perish, and now you sit at a table where chance has no seat. Van's hand twitched once, then froze. The room felt suddenly smaller, as if the walls themselves were waiting for the final card to fall. When Wolfe speaks his final deduction, it isn't revelation. It's judgment. He lifted the small object from his desk, turning it between his fingers. It gleamed faintly under the lamplight. The missing wheel, he said. Presented as carved ivory, an emblem of whimsy. In truth, platinum. Worth enough to purchase loyalty or silence, or a human life. Its weight was not symbolic, Mr. Van. It was literal, the instrument of your greed. Van stared, all polish gone. That's absurd, he rasped. On the contrary, Wolfe murmured, It is inevitable. When Miss Keller recognized the deception, you silenced her. When Hale demanded restitution, you granted it in death. The wheel never vanished. It merely rolled back to its maker. He set it down with delicate finality. You were never the dealer, Mr. Van. You were the game, and the game, alas, is over. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was not empty. It was full. The sound of a man realizing his own pattern had run to its end. It happened quickly, quicker than guilt deserves. The front door burst open, and Inspector Kramer entered with 2 men in tow, their timing as precise as Wolfe's patience. Van rose, hand darting to his coat, and for an instant the air held its breath. Then Wolfe's voice cut through it, calm, unhurried, final. "The odds, Mr. Van," he said, "are no longer in your favor." The words did what the gun could not. Van froze, the weight of inevitability settling where defiance had been. I moved in, relieving him of the revolver before the room remembered to exhale. Kramer's face went from fury to grim satisfaction. Wolfe merely closed his eyes, as though the outcome had been predetermined all along. I looked at Van, the gambler who'd thought he could play against fate and win, and couldn't resist a quiet thought. In Wolfe's house, every game ends the same way. The house always wins. And this one, I knew, was far from over. The brownstone had never felt so quiet. It wasn't the comfortable silence of an afternoon after lunch, or the perfumed hush of Wolfe's orchid rooms. This was something else, a silence with edges, brittle enough to break if anyone so much as breathed wrong. Van sat rigid in the red leather chair, the colour already drained from his face, his composure reduced to fragments. Wolfe had just finished with him. Not loudly, not cruelly, just thoroughly. The truth lay across the desk like a body waiting for burial. Wolfe himself had leaned back, eyes closed, fingers steepled. I'd seen him like that before, the mind winding down after finishing a hunt. But this time, there was something in the air that refused to settle. Maybe it was the way Van's hands twitched against his knees. Maybe it was Wolfe's stillness, too absolute, as though the room had become a sealed equation. In Wolfe's world, quiet was never peace. It was the breath held before the verdict, the pause before the avalanche. I was thinking that when the night outside broke its silence, with the unmistakable sound of a gun, the first shot was close enough to make the windows tremble. Van jerked sideways, his hand clutching air, and before Wolfe's name left my throat, he was already sliding off the chair. I was at the door in 2 strides, the second shot, splitting the air just as my hand hit the knob. The hallway echoed with confusion. Fritz shouting something from the kitchen, Wolfe's voice commanding calm that no one could hear. I threw the door open to a night smeared with rain and noise. The street lamp bled a pale circle of light onto the pavement, where movement flickered once and then went still. Behind me, Wolfe's voice came low and measured. "Mr. Goodwin, ascertain." Van was beyond help, that much was certain. The bullet had done its arithmetic cleanly. I looked at his face, composed, almost surprised, and then at the dark trail leading toward the open door. Someone had decided that fate needed assistance. The air outside was colder than before, the kind that carries smoke and gunpowder as if proud of both. Somewhere below that sound, another breath waited. The city's, maybe mine, holding itself for what would come next. I found her at the end of the trail, sprawled beneath the streetlight, the revolver still warm in her hand. Claire Latham, elegant even in collapse. The rain had started again, fine and steady, touching her face like something trying to wake her. Her last gesture had been perfect symmetry. 2 bullets, 2 deaths, and a silence no confession could fill. Whatever she'd meant by stopping the wheel, she'd done it thoroughly. The sirens came fast, slicing through the night like an insult. Within minutes, the street was full of uniforms, flashlights, and orders shouted by men who didn't yet know what they were walking into. I stayed where I was, one hand in my coat pocket, the other closing around the revolver before it could be trampled. When I turned back toward the brownstone, Wolfe was at the doorway, unmoving, framed in lamplight. Even from there, I could see the question in his eyes, the one he would never ask aloud. The wheel had stopped turning, yes, but not before it had crushed everyone under it. The letter was found by one of Kramer's men in Claire's handbag. Cream-colored paper, faint perfume, handwriting so graceful it made the words hurt. I unfolded it in Wolfe's office while the inspector stood over me, face carved from anger and disbelief. "I loved him," it began. "I loved his brilliance, his cruelty, and his belief that luck was a god he could master. I helped him cheat, thinking love could absolve deceit. I was wrong. The wheel turned, and when it came for him, I could not let it turn again." The rest was short, deliberate, final. "I have stopped the game. Forgive me." Wolfe listened without movement, his eyes on the edge of the desk rather than the page. When I finished, he said nothing. The silence was heavy enough to bend the air. That was when Kramer burst in, his coat still wet from the rain. "You always leave a mess behind you, don't you?" he growled. "Two dead, one confession, and you sitting pretty in the middle of it." Wolfe's expression didn't change. "I sit, Inspector," he said mildly, "because motion would not alter the sum." That was when I knew the real storm hadn't started yet. If words could ignite dynamite, Kramer's would have leveled the house. He paced the office like a man trying to walk off betrayal, his fists clenching and unclenching. "You played her, Wolfe. You sat there and let her pull the trigger." Wolfe didn't flinch. "I did nothing of the sort. Miss Latham's actions were her own. You could have stopped it." "I could have," Wolfe admitted. "But she was already beyond persuasion. I am not the custodian of fools who spin their own ruin." That one landed. Kramer turned on his heel, face flushed, jaw tight. "You sit there like a king handing down death sentences and call it intellect. You make me sick." "Then leave," Wolfe said evenly. "Your disgust adds nothing to the record." For once, Kramer obeyed. When the door closed behind him, the quiet felt wrong again, stretched thin, ready to break. I looked at Wolfe, but his eyes were already fixed on the torn playing cards scattered across the desk. The expression on his face wasn't triumph. It was something colder. The look of a man staring into the arithmetic of guilt. By the time the police left, the brownstone felt hollow. I gathered the papers from the floor, brushed off the rug, and opened the window to chase out the smell of cordite that refused to leave. The night outside was still wet, the kind of darkness that clings. There was no satisfaction in any of it. Wolfe had won, if you could call it that. But the air didn't feel like victory. The case had closed itself with gunfire instead of logic, and that offended him more than Kramer ever could. I've seen endings before, good, bad, and in between, but this one stuck. Maybe it was because the answers had come too late, or because the truth, once found, had no one left to hear it. When I turned off the lamp, the silence that followed felt earned, but not deserved. The next morning, Wolfe instructed me to bring the envelope of torn cards from the safe. He didn't look at me when he spoke, just reached for the poker and stirred the fire until it glowed white. "Games of fortune," he said, "should never be replayed." The cards went into the flames one by one, curling inward like small confessions. The inked symbols blackened, the paper shriveled, and the ashes rose, turning the air above the hearth grey and soft. I stood behind him, watching the smoke climb and twist. Maybe he was mourning the victims, or maybe he was mourning the illusion that mind alone could master chance. When the last corner turned to dust, Wolfe exhaled, a sound half sigh, half verdict. He didn't look at me, and I didn't speak. Outside, the city kept moving, indifferent as always. Inside, the fire whispered the only truth left worth hearing. Every game ends, but the players never stop believing they can win. The brownstone had resumed its samtaos rhythm, or tried to. Fritz was humming in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with his usual reverence. and Wolfe was upstairs among the orchids, a priest in his private chapel. From the street below came the sound of cabs, horns, and that steady urban heartbeat that New York calls peace. It was, on paper, an ordinary morning. But the quiet inside the house wasn't peace, it was residue. The air felt heavier, as though thought itself had weight. Wolfe had been more taciturn than usual, which, given the standard, was saying something, and even Fritz's clinking cutlery sounded too cautious, too polite, as if the walls themselves were still recovering from the echo of the last gunshot. I sat at my desk, pretending to read the Gazette, though the words wouldn't stay still. Routine has its virtues, but after a case like the fortune game, it felt like painting over cracks in a wall that still trembled. Wolfe would call it equilibrium restored. I called it aftermath. And if there's one thing I've learned working for him, it's that silence, in this house, is never really empty. It's just thinking. When a case ends, Wolfe moves on the way a glacier melts, imperceptibly, but with force. I, on the other hand, tend to remember the faces. The fortune game had no shortage of those. Marion Keller, earnest and frightened. Barton Hale, too clever by half. Dudley Van, polished as deceit itself. And Claire Latham, whose tragedy was that she believed love could break the rules of chance. Each of them had gambled something more personal than money. Marion had wagered courage, Hale his pride, Van his control, and Claire her heart. They all lost. Wolfe, of course, would disagree with my phrasing. He'd say the outcome was inevitable arithmetic. In his world, motive and error are equations that always balance, even if the answer comes written in blood. I tried to see it that way, to admire the neatness of logic closing its circle. But I couldn't. To me, it wasn't order. It was waste. Human waste. The kind that leaves its mark even after the ledger is clean. Wolfe might have solved the game, but I wasn't sure either of us had really won. Around 11, Fritz brought in the morning mail. One bill, one catalogue, and one envelope with handwriting that looked like it had been bullied by its owner. I recognized the scrawl before Fritz did. Kramer's. I slit it open and read it aloud. My office acknowledges your assistance, though not your methods. The result speaks for itself. Don't expect thanks. I laughed. That's as close as he's ever come to sending flowers. Wolfe took the note, scanned it, and gave a sound somewhere between a snort and a sigh. Gratitude expressed grudgingly is indistinguishable from insult. You may file it under debris. Meaning? I asked. Meaning, he said, settling back in his chair. Luck is the enemy of logic. Inspector Kramer mistakes one for the other. I tucked the letter into a drawer. Kramer's grudging respect was almost affectionate in its hostility, but Wolfe would never admit to enjoying it. Between those two, admiration always arrived disguised as irritation, the only language both were fluent in. Lunch at the Brownstone has more sanctity than most courtrooms, and that afternoon's menu, beer, sauerkraut, and Fritz's braised lamb, deserved reverence. Wolfe ate with his usual deliberation, and I knew better than to interrupt until he had mopped the last trace of sauce with bread. When he finally leaned back, eyes half closed, he spoke without preamble. Men call it fortune, Mr. Goodwin, when they cannot name their own errors. That sounds cheerful, I said. It is accurate, he replied. The illusion of chance comforts the incompetent. A gambler believes he loses to luck because the alternative, that he loses to himself, is intolerable. He reached for his beer, studying the glass as if it might argue. The so-called fortune game merely gave vice a parlour. Remove the trappings, and you have the oldest human pastime, the worship of control. I let him talk. He was in one of his post-case moods, half lecture, half lamentation. You make it sound tragic, I said. He nodded once. It is. Tragedy, Mr. Goodwin, is logic's shadow. I didn't argue. You don't, when Wolfe's in philosopher mode. You just make sure you're the one holding the bill for the beer, not the conscience. Later, Wolfe retreated to his orchids, leaving me in the office with the files, the ashtray, and too much quiet. I leaned back and let the case replay itself behind my eyes. I saw them all again. Marian's terror, Hale's arrogance, Van's brittle calm, Claire's desperate grace. They'd all believed they could outwit fate, and in their own way, each had proven Wolfe's point. The arithmetic never fails, only the people do. Still, it sat wrong with me. Justice, if that's what we'd achieved, didn't feel like winning. It felt like stopping a wheel just before it crushed another body. Maybe that was victory enough. Wolfe would say the game was inevitable, that each player had written his own end. Maybe he was right. But as I looked at the empty chair across the desk, the one Van had occupied before everything fell apart, I couldn't help wondering whether intellect alone ever made a clean finish. Some things you solve, others you just survive. And the difference, I'd learned, was mostly timing. I was sorting mail again when my hand brushed the deck of cards, still sitting on Wolfe's desk, a relic from the case, left there like an afterthought. I picked it up, gave it a shuffle, and stopped halfway through. The sound of the cards sliding against each other was too sharp, too alive for the room it was in. Wolfe looked up from his book. "Must you fidget?" "Just testing probability," I said. He set the book aside, his eyes narrowing. "If you must play, Mr. Goodwin, play with certainty. Or not at all." There was no sting in it, just that cool, professorial tone that could turn advice into an epitaph. I put the deck down, aligning the corners as neatly as he'd want them. He returned to his book, and I to my chair, both of us pretending the conversation had ended. But his words stayed, like an aftertaste. In Wolfe's universe, chance didn't exist, only cause, consequence, and the people foolish enough to mistake one for the other. It was later, near evening, when the quiet settled into something almost human. Wolfe had dozed off with a book on his lap, and I sat there, half thinking, half drifting. Cases have a way of leaving residue, not guilt exactly, but awareness. I found myself thinking of the fortune game again, of the faces around that cursed table, and of Wolfe, seated as always in judgment above the fray. It struck me, suddenly and without humour, that every game needs a dealer, someone who knows the odds, sets the pace, and never wagers more than he can afford. Some games, I said aloud, don't end when the cards are down. They end when you realise who was dealing all along. Wolfe stirred, opened one eye, and gave me that half glare he reserves for statements that aren't entirely foolish. "Indeed," he murmured, closing it again. I smiled a little, because in that moment, I knew what he knew. In this house, fortune wasn't luck, it was management. And the house, as always, belonged to Nero Wolfe. When the smoke finally cleared and the last card turned to ash, the brownstone was quiet again. The kind of quiet that comes after truth has spoken and left no room for argument. Wolfe returned to his orchids, I to my desk, and the city outside went on pretending that luck still ruled men's lives. But I kept thinking about the fortune game, about those who played for love or pride, or the illusion of control, and lost all three. What do you think? Was it justice, or just the wheel of fate completing its turn? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes.